Okay, we're live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to people like you. With us on the program today, we're going to be talking with Yana Ludwig. She was a U.S. Senate candidate in Wyoming. Her primary had ended yesterday, and she did fall short. And so we're going to be doing a little bit of a retrospective on the campaign and what us progressives, the socialists that are in our audience, what they need to be doing to be able to better reach out to these red state voters, these rural state voters, as well as, generally what it was like campaigning through this whole crisis and what we can take away from this going forward to future election cycles. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with Yana. Let's start getting into that, guys. Okay, we got Yana here. How you doing, Yana?
Good. I was just kind of like rocking out with your music there. That was cool.
I know. It's a nice little mellow setter before we come in. And so, I had told the audience before while I was introducing you that you had just gone through the whirlwind yesterday, that yesterday was your primary in Wyoming. And I think before we reflect on the campaign and what was, I'd love to just focus on what inspired you in the first place? Why was there this need that you wanted to run for office, especially as someone who is towards the left in such red state like Wyoming?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It is kind of fun the day after to be able to do a little retrospective. Yeah, I mean, I got into this mostly because of climate disruption. I mean, that's been my focus and my work for the last 5 or 6 years. And what I was seeing is that most of the solutions that were being proposed around climate were also not very economically savvy. And so it was like, let's do all of these things that are going to really screw over poor people and working class people. And that's going to fix it. And I'm like, that is not going to fix it, actually. So, recognizing that I had kind of unique background in terms of having worked both the economic justice and racial justice edge of things and the climate edge of things. And also that I'm a socialist, but I'm also very much a local focused person. And that plays a lot better in red states than all of this, let the national government take over everything kind of, approach that sometimes people get into a little bit. And so I just realized that, we're a small state. We have 570,000 people total. And there's not a lot of people with that kind of real intersectional background in the state. And so, it felt like I had something to bring to the table, and also know that there's been a lot of socialist organizing that's tried to get off the ground in the state and hasn't really had, there wasn't sort of a kick in the ass for the socialist world in Wyoming, and having somebody actually go very public as a socialist, I thought would help with that. So it was kind of a bunch of stuff that converged for me.
Okay. So, Yana, one part of that I'd love to focus in on is that environmental side. I think I'd love to hear what are some of those examples of not economically progressive solutions that you were trying to make sure were being called out in that campaign of yours.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one of them is that, I feel like the international approach to climate stuff, sometimes leaves countries out who are mostly poor people, mostly brown and black people. And that, we need people in there who are saying it's not okay to be proposing things there's all these things like techno fixes, some of which get into very big picture things that would make it better on the Northern Hemisphere and a lot worse on the Southern Hemisphere, for instance. You also see a lot of things where it's well, let's just tax carbon. And it's well, that's fine as long as you don't have to drive to work and you're on a super incredibly tight budget. Yes, that's going to reduce the consumption of carbon, but it's also going to leave poor and working class people in this country, in an even tighter place and an even more difficult place, because they're just going to jack the prices, because that is what capitalists do. And so
I'd love to follow just up on that quickly, the carbon tax part, because, I think some people see it as, yes, it's going to try and have the price decentivize people from using gasoline. Do you think it could be counteracted with a redistribution method? Sure. Alaska, they have the oil dividend. Do you think that the carbon tax is just bad left on its own? Or could we use that revenue potentially in a progressive manner that could offset it?
Yeah, and the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is an organization that's been doing work for about a decade now, and very across the aisle kind of work, that's basically their proposal. And I like that of all the carbon taxes, but that's not the one that people talk about in Wyoming and are really afraid of
Yeah.
in Wyoming. I mean, they're just afraid of anything that hurts the fossil fuel industry, except of course it's dying anyway. And so that's been a lot of what I've been out there talking about, so I've been in this race for 14 months because I started last June, and have gotten out there and actually had conversations with coal miners and, been talking to people on the ground about I don't believe that coal is anything other than in hospice at this point, and that we need to be taking care of fossil fuel workers, and that was a big part of what I talked about. And it's actually interesting, the only county that I won was one that's like a really heavy coal county, which is fascinating to me because you wouldn't expect a scary socialist, which was my label through most of the campaign, to do well there. But it's because I went out and actually connected with coal miners about let's actually look at ways to protect your livelihood as this thing is dying around you. And so, I do think that carbon taxes scare the crap out of people because the industry is already really fragile. But to me, it's like, well, let's deal with the fragility and not freak out about the taxes.
So I want to clarify there, like from those conversations that you did have with those populations, like is the biggest concern just the economic implications of this proposal and how they'll be taken care of? Do they just not believe in the impacts? Like what is that big hurdle that we have to overcome with those voters for them to see that we do need to make this shift away from fossil fuels? Is it just making sure they're whole, or is it getting them to understand the science? Where did you find yourself trying to land with them?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is economic insecurity, but of course that makes it harder to look at the science, and so I think that the two things are pretty deeply connected for a lot of people. And the coal miners that I talk to, they know they're in a dying industry. Like the denial is not at the fossil fuel worker level. The denial is really at the politician level, I think. And so that was one of the things that I committed to was we're not going to not talk about climate, and we're not going to not talk about economic insecurity. We need to be talking about both of those things, and we need to make it clear that we can connect them together in a positive and empowering way, instead of in this like really science denying, disempowering way that I feel like it has been connected together in Wyoming politics.
I certainly hear you there. And so I'd love to ask you in those same conversations, I think you knew from the get-go, being that it is Wyoming, it's a very red state traditionally, at least that's where it was as of 2018. And so I'd love to ask you, in your opinion, what was your strategy about trying to reach them? Was it, talk to them on some of their terms, try to have your platform have some traditional conservative values, or is it more of a messaging campaign of trying to just win them over to our side? Like, how did you try to play that dynamic knowing you were going to be an underdog from the get-go?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, John, because my whole thing was I'm not going to run unless I can run honest. And I am genuinely a socialist and genuinely a localist and genuinely an anti-oppression activist. And so I talked from all of those perspectives, depending on what the conversation was that I was in. And, sometimes we totally missed each other. And I do think that they're not used to, nobody in this state is used to Democrats using phrases like local self-determination are just not phrases that you hear in politics here. And that was something that I was really big on. I had, a couple of times my closing statements for our debates, included things like, what does Cody want for Cody? And what does Gillette want for Gillette? And like really bringing it back to local economics, and talked a lot about worker-owned cooperatives, which to me is like that's actually what socialism is about, is worker ownership. And like how different would it have been over the last 5 years if the coal miners had actually owned those mines? Like how different would the entire thing have been? And like just getting very real about like your bosses and your owners have made terrible decisions about your pensions. A lot of these coal miners figured out that they were losing their jobs because their paychecks bounced on a Friday. That was literally how they found out. And it's like, that's just bullshit. And so like being able to go in and like name that of like, that is unethical. That should not be happening. And I would like to see you be in the driver's seat actually with whatever business endeavors you move into next, like wherever you're working next, like you should be the one who's calling the shots rather than having, CEOs walk away with like $200,000 bonuses while your paycheck is bouncing. Like, let's get very real about the impact that that's had on your family and the impact that's had on your communities. And so a lot of the conversations were just like very much like, how was your Friday? And like very human.
Yeah.
And that's contrasted to more moderate Democrats who will say things like, well, coal miners should just fill in the blank.
Kind of paternalistic. Yeah, it's not empowering them.
It's so paternalistic.
Yeah.
And I would name it as such. And I would say, like, I don't agree with my Democratic colleagues who say stuff like that. I think you are real people who have real dreams for your lives. And we don't get to dictate what your lives are going to look like in 6 months or 3 years. You get to decide that.
So, Yana, I'd love to press on that a little bit further. I think a lot of people like some of these aspects behind socialism, but they're a little maybe nervous around embracing the label. I think a lot of people in the public start thinking of that whole statist kind of version, like a USSR or the China. How do you try to break that preconception? Because I think, I don't know if I prescribe it myself. I used to be a democratic socialist. I'm now more like a democratic universalist. But it's like, I think that socialism kind of scares some people off. How do you try and break through and define it for people so they feel less scared to try and embrace it themselves?
Well, the number one thing was that I never avoided the word. The reality is anybody running as a Democrat in the state of Wyoming is going to get accused of being a scary socialist. Anybody. Sure. It doesn't matter how much of a neoliberal you are going to get that accusation. And so, my approach has basically been like, somebody says it and I'm like, yeah, let's talk about it. And then actually open up a real conversation about it and talk about worker ownership. That's been the approach.
It's a lot harder to weaponize it against you when you're embracing it. It's like you're not constantly on the run. You can fight back and say, like, okay,
I know.
As you think.
And it's actually the thing that I'm the most bummed about losing the primary last night is that I really wanted to get into that with the Republican nominee. And because the person who is the Republican nominee who was expected to get nominated last night has been using the phrase scary socialist over and over and over again. And I just really wanted to be on stage with her and go like, yeah, bring it. Let's talk about it.
Let's see how scary I am.
I know. And like as a 1%er, I understand why you are scared to death of people like me. But here's what it really means, and I'm going to miss the chance to do that. So that's my one biggest regret about the whole thing, how it played out last night, because the other person is a neoliberal and you can't counteract Republican fascism with Democratic neoliberalism. There's nothing that actually
we haven't had particularly great results at the swing. It's why I'm a little nervous. Like I got myself very invested. Speaking of other races in like Kentucky, for example, they had the whole Charles Booker. They even had Mike Breuer, both candidates, and we ended up with Amy McGrath because they're important seats to flip. Like I think we can both. I don't know if you will acknowledge this, but I will acknowledge this. I do think the neoliberals are better than the neoconservatives. And I would like to see having a Democrat in that seat instead of a Republican. Would you say that? Like, what do you think is going to be your relationship come the fall? Are you going to support her? Like, are you going to try and push her on some issues? Have you even come to that thought? Like, I know it's very fresh. Like, what was your relationship with the other candidate?
Right.
Well, and it was Murphy and David, right? Like that was the one.
Yeah, David. I mean, I do think that I'm going to continue to push, and she got to watch me push on. So we had a younger man, neolib, very privileged, was the third sort of main candidate. We had 6 candidates in here, but there were really 3 of us who were viable, and and she got to watch me really push on him in our debates about healthcare stuff. And, he was doing the Medicare for all who want it thing. And so, I am going to keep pushing on her to keep moving it left. And they both moved left over the course of the campaign. And so my sense is that I was really controlling the narrative, and whether she now backs off of that or not, I don't know, but I'm certainly going to be watching for that and continuing to push. And she is absolutely a better choice than Cynthia Lummis, who's a multimillionaire. I don't mean to be ageist, but she's 75 years old and she's been a career politician for a very long time. And I don't think any of that is good. Plus, she's running on I have Trump's back. I'm like, it's just gross, you know? So Merav is absolutely a better choice. And I'm going to see if I can keep moving her to the left, you know.
So I'd love to ask you, Yana, what are some of those ideas? Like, I know we were just talking about beforehand of how, like, some people see socialism as a little status, and you want to give people that determination for themselves.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to ask you, what are some of those policies you were fighting for that you think empower individuals to be stronger as an individual from that collective sharing of resources?
Yeah, well, it's not only stronger as an individual, but also stronger as local small communities. And so both of those things were big talking points for me. So, you know, one of them definitely is about worker ownership and about strong unions and really moving the center of power in our economy back toward workers, you know, with whatever means we can get. And, you know, in a lot of places, that's going to be strengthening unions. But I do think worker ownership is actually like really appealing to people. Like very few people love their bosses. They're absolutely out there, but very few actually really like the setup that we have and the fact that they really have no power in their workplaces.
Yeah, it comes to the fact we also have like 80% of people just hating their job in general.
Totally, which you can totally understand. And that's also
Yeah.
a capitalism thing. I mean, you know, the work that gets paid in our culture is work that somebody has figured out how to make a profit off of. And it doesn't actually have anything to do with what we need. You know, or at least there's a pretty big disconnect between those two things. And so, you know, so I talked about that a lot. I also was talking about things like public banks and, you know, like the Bank of North Dakota. I actually sent a proposal to our entire state legislature and the governor and the state treasurer's office for a Wyoming public bank, and was talking about how this would keep Wyoming dollars in Wyoming, like emphasizing, you know, like aligning with the kind of states' rights vibe around that. But also it would make it less expensive for our cities and counties to be, you know, maintaining their infrastructure because they could get their loans from the state bank at lower interest rates. And this is on top of our governor, who recently made some statements about how we may be needing to abandon some of our communities because the state doesn't have the money to maintain roads and sewers anymore. This is what like Republican rule in Wyoming has gotten us. And so I'm like, hello, there's this thing that could actually like make it a lot better and would actually give our, you know, city and county governments more empowerment and also be a positive line item in our state budget, which we desperately need because fossil fuels are tanking and we have no income tax in the state. So it's stuff like that and sort of putting it together where it's like, all of that is actually very appealing to a lot of Republicans who don't want to see taxes start happening in the state. And it's like, well, here's this alternate method for doing it, and it would give us state power. And by the way, we can also, you know, say a big F you to Wall Street in the process, which
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing is trying to bring power as close as possible back to the people. And I'd love to focus on one of those before like thinking about the campaigning and how you tried to approach it. I first wanted to understand like the workplace democracy. I think a lot of people, when they think of this capitalist socialist divide, they don't understand like necessarily like, what is like wage like thieving that you think is coming from the capitalist system. What does actual empowerment in the workplace do for the worker? What are the tangible benefits that you think come from that? And how is it structured? Is it just saying 50% of the board are employees? Like, how do you try to structure that system?
Yeah, well, so I work with worker-owned cooperatives as, you know, part of my work in the world right now. And how they're structured actually varies a lot depending on how big they are mostly. And so smaller worker-owned cooperatives, you know, they're, you know, if you are 5 people or 10 people or 15 people, you can actually make a lot of decisions as a collective. And if you're big, you know, like we have some worker-owned cooperatives in the US that are, you know, hundreds and even thousands of people. And usually what happens is that there is annual elections where you're actually electing your managers, and you can kick your manager out if you don't like them and you feel like they're being abusive. And one of the big ways that it's empowering, I mean, it's not just that, but it's also that you get away from this dynamic where right now in the US, the CEO to worker wage ratio or earnings ratio is about 360 to 1.
Yeah.
And so no worker cooperative ever has had a meeting where somebody has said, hey, you know, Bob is just so much cooler than the rest of us. He should be making 360 times what we're making. It just doesn't happen when people are actually in control of wages. And so that 360 times your wage can get redistributed among all the workers, and everybody can be making more money or working fewer hours or some combination of those two things, and, and protecting their benefits and actually knowing when something is going to happen, and making those decisions about like, when do we do layoffs and what.
Yeah, there's a lot more security in that. It's just a peace of mind that that it's not just your boss who's looking to manage the bottom line only. It's the collective who knows. And it's also like, it's good if you have bad workers too. Like, who's going to know the best if there's a bad worker? The person who's right beside them all the time and saying like, oh, I have to pick up for this dude. So it does work both ways. And I highly embrace this. We here at the Hill of Roses as an organization with the 25 of us right now, we're a cooperative. So I do hope more people will embrace that model.
Awesome.
So with that being said, I'd love to focus now on the last part, which is obviously you ran a campaign. There has to be lessons from what worked well, what didn't work well. What was your main approach of how you tried to get to know voters? Was it just going to events, going to local town meetings? Obviously, you said beforehand you had a large experience of being local in the area, but what was your process, especially in these COVID times where it's a little bit harder to get as much face-to-face, and in Wyoming, which is kind of sparse?
Oh, spread out. So spread out. Yeah. Well, so I feel fortunate that I got in before COVID hit. And so from like June until about when the snow starts closing down the highways regularly, which happens in Wyoming. So we're at like 7,200 feet here in Laramie. So we're at high elevation and snow, and so frequently stuff shuts down. So between about June and December, I was out going to local communities pretty regularly and talking to people, meeting with people, mostly in public libraries. Actually, that was my favorite. I'm public infrastructure, all about it. So I'm like, meet me in a park or a library and let's talk politics. So I got a chance to do a lot of that before anybody else was even in the race. And that was great. And then when we had to go online, I'm actually super comfortable with like interviews like this and being online and Zoom and whatnot.
You're doing a good job so far.
Yeah, it's no problem for me. I can handle this stuff. And so we actually have this huge video library at this point that I created over the course. Like once COVID hit, I started doing 2 videos a week that are like somewhere between like 8 and 45 minutes long. And some of them were interactive with other people there. And some of them were just me talking about a thing. And so we've really created a video library for what does a socialist agenda look like in a rural red state. And those got tons of watches. And so we've been doing a lot of that and, doing a lot of social media stuff. And then these last about 6 weeks, it's been a lot of debates and candidate forums. And that's also a format that I'm really comfortable in. So, I feel fortunate that I had done a national speaking tour in 2015 and got very used to lots of public speaking stuff. And so I leaned into that background a lot.
Sure.
And was able to, meet people in lots of different ways through the campaign. So that's been good. I also got involved with the local Democratic Party and like showed up at the county convention and the state convention and showed up as a useful human being in those spaces.
That's very needed. Yeah.
I know, as opposed to some of the candidates where I was like, what are you doing? Like, oh my God, did you really just say that? And so we got worker ownership and public and postal banking and a really pro-worker Green New Deal into the state party's platform. And, by just like showing up and like being really bold and going like, hey, we need to do this. This is the right thing to do for working class people. And so it's been a lot of different ways of interacting with folks, actually. It's been really fun.
Well, I have to ask, there's definitely going to be some things we could wish we had taken back during a campaign. Some things we wish if we had more opportunities we could have done. And so I'd love to ask you, what would be something that you would, if you could do it again, you would not do, like you think was a mistake during the campaign, if any? And then furthermore, let's say you had even more resources. What would have been something that your campaign could have done to help the race along?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that second one is huge because, I'm like, I have a negative net worth. I had no personal resources to put into this at all. And so, if we had had another $50,000, I think we would have won last night because we would have been able to do the kind of outreach that my opponent, who was able to do a lot of self-financing, was able to just pull out of her own pocket and like throw a bunch of money at stuff. So, I mean, I do think that's a big one. And I think I probably would have worked harder. There's a couple key endorsements that would have really helped with fundraising. And I feel like, at some point after you've heard for the 5th time after filling out a lengthy application if you don't already have $1 million, why should we endorse you, basically?
It's like, part of the thing of why we want your endorsements is so we can reach that $1 million.
So circular. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I think I would have worked harder earlier, because just one of those endorsements, could have made that $50,000 difference. And I definitely like my a little too independent streak kicked in at some point. I was like, fine, I'll do it without you, and like, I don't need these big organizations. And I think that was probably a mistake at some point. I think I should have worked harder on that. And it's also like that independent streak kicks in because the system is so fucked up. It's like,
Yeah.
why are you not endorsing based on like, I'm the person who has their head screwed on the straightest of all of the candidates. Why is that not the endorsement criteria? But it's not. And so much who gives a crap about Wyoming. I mean, there's so much of that attitude among the big national organizations. And so it was hard.
Well, there's lessons for the future, and we hope that they will be taken either by yourself in another campaign. Give yourself some relaxation time. We're not pressuring you now, but either in the future or some future socialist who wants to run in the area. The last thing I'd love to focus on is kind of building that larger movement. You're part of the Rose Caucus, and so I'd love to ask you about can you help us understand what the Rose Caucus? We here at the Hill of Roses would love to know about roses. Yeah. And furthermore, can you tell us, what the long-term plan beyond just like what the Rose Caucus supports?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Rose Caucus was started. So I was one of the founding members of it, and we are basically a candidate co-endorsement coalition. And so a bunch of us got together and we were like, so we're going to endorse each other. We're going to support each other's campaigns, and then went to work on really developing a deep platform. And we based it off of Joshua Collins' platform. And he was one of the other founding members and was sort of the one whose staff got excited about, let's get other candidates involved, which is, and however people feel about Joshua, like he did us a really good turn by getting the Rose Caucus together, because all of us had support behind the scenes with people who really got it, what we were trying to do. And, I think there would have been some really hard moments with this campaign that I'm not sure what I would have done with if I hadn't had that support. And so it was about having behind the scenes support where we didn't have to constantly justify our existence as a candidate to other people. And then that platform work was really important. And I don't know if folks have checked out the platform, but go check it out at rosecaucus.com. And we put a lot of really good work into it. And I actually got to facilitate a bunch of those meetings. And so it was great working with candidates from all over the country. As far as the long term, I actually have been really checked out for the last 6 weeks from the Rose Caucus. I've been so focused on my own campaign. And so, we're moving toward actually being a formal nonprofit. And, the plan is to really create a platform for candidates to get the kind of support that I really benefited from, and to be really articulating like, what does socialism mean? Because as you say, there's so much that people are really confused about, and they have these pictures in their heads of what we're talking about, and it's really not what we're talking about. And so I think the Rose Caucus has the potential to really help move that ball in the long run.
I wholeheartely agree with. There was a lot of effort that was put into it. I had seen that platform, and it was quite robust. I think it was over 40 pages, like 45, something like in that range. It was massive. And so I agree with you that it really does help when you build that kind of infrastructure. Because do we expect one person to know the answers for every single problem? I've always thought for candidates in the progressive movement, we could use a starter kit.
Totally.
That is something that people need.
Starter kit. That's what the Rose Caucus is. We're the starter kit.
Yeah. And I certainly hope it can continue to develop that. We here at the Hill of Roses are trying to define our own platform. That's something we might release come November. But it certainly has to be quite the endeavor. How'd you guys try and do that collaboration? That'll be the last question I have before I go to one for the audience. I have to ask you, it was such a monstrosity is a negative light, but it was gargantuan. How did you guys come together to figure out that vision?
Right. Well, and like I say, we were able to piggyback on Joshua's work, and he had some really smart Zoomer millennial staff who just were brilliant.
Yeah.
Totally fucking brilliant young people. And so we built off of that, but then we had a weekly policy development meeting on Discord, and so that was our organizing space, and lots of chats in between, lots of, hey, go look at this kind of stuff. And so we really had a very dynamic space going. And and then once a week we'd get together and I'd facilitate, and we'd get into the weeds about this stuff and talk about, like, well, why this, and like, do we completely get rid of the NSA? Do we transform the NSA? Like really into all the weeds. And there was a really fabulous secondary function going on there, which was educating each other. Like, I know so much more about foreign policy because the foreign policy geeks would come to the space and do their thing. And they know a lot more about climate because I would geek out on climate in those meetings. And so I think that's really important too, is that, because you're right, it is overwhelming, all the different issues that you're expected to have a handle on, particularly when you're running for federal office. And the Rose Caucus provides a space for that kind of education, like co-education as well as co-endorsement.
So, I lied. I have one more question that inspired a great thought. And, I wanted to just ask, like, how do you try to level set with voters? Like, one of the things that we have, it's a little easier for yourself running for a Senate seat. You get 6 years in the term. Like, you can have a large, robust thing. But, like, we've talked to a lot of House candidates. And I think sometimes people feel like, I support you here, all these things individually. But, like, all together, it feels like a lot to them to try and do and promise in a 2-year span. Like, what do you think is that balance? Like, do you think we should be speaking to voters on what the long-term solutions needed are on all these different areas, or focus voters on, like, hey, I'm laser focused on these couple issues. Everything else, there are going to be other people in Congress doing that, but I'm focused on just this. What do you think is that proper balance for people to have? Because obviously, this platform is going to try and cover the sun, but, like, what would you advise candidates? Like, focus narrowly on key issues, or try and cover all these different types of voters' needs?
Gosh, I think that this is a little bit of a state-specific question. I mean, like in Wyoming, I was able to be talking a lot about fossil fuels and a lot about economic security and a lot about the suicide epidemic. Those are big things that are on everybody's minds here. And I also think that you really inspire people to get involved with your campaign if you've got that big picture vision. And so I think, like, I would say have your website really lay out, specifics. Like general platitudes are not going to do it. Like, you got to get specific enough on your website so that people see, like, oh, this person's actually thought it through. They're not just like, I'm concerned about suicide. It's like, okay, what are we doing about it? And playing that out and then referencing people to that. But then I do think that you're going to need a few things to focus on when you're out there on the campaign trail. And in our case, it was sometimes county specific, in those counties where there were a lot of fossil fuel workers. Like, I was leaning much more into that, like, colas and hospice kind of conversation, and then, in other counties that were more progressive, being able to, like, lean into sort of the more traditional package of progressive and democratic talking points. And, I think you've got to know your audience. I mean, that is the number one thing. And, if you don't know your audience going into it, you got to do some research before you declare, because they will immediately start asking you really pesky questions, and you got to have something to give people. And I think just talking to people as real human beings and not buying in too much to these stereotypes about who people are and what they want. It's like, I'm going to bring my authentic self into a conversation with your authentic self and see where we go. And it's actually much more fun campaigning that way too.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you there. It's definitely a balance we all have to strike at times. And at the end of the day, all politics is going to be local. So take everything with a grain of salt. Your community probably has some specific issues it wants you to hammer down on. With that being said, let's go to 2 fan questions before we wrap up today. The first question here is from Anna. Anna wanted to ask, what resources would you recommend for someone if they want to learn more about socialism that hasn't been falsified? I don't know what TOP is supposed to stand for, but what resources would you recommend people to try and learn more about socialism?
Well, I think we have a really good resource in Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, the dsausa.org website has some really good starter kit things for folks. And, I certainly leaned into those a couple times on the campaign trail. But I think what was really helpful for me was getting some simple way to explain things in ways that were really accessible to people. And actually, I'll tell you the thing that I was doing. I was taking, and again, I'm a facilitator, so I think in like large pieces of paper and markers is sort of my friend. And so I took a big piece of paper and like divided it into 4 quadrants and put capitalism at the top and socialism or socialized systems at the bottom, multinational and local on the other 2 axes. And then I asked people to map the economy. I was like, let's talk about what are multinational examples of capitalism and local examples of capitalism, and and sort of helped people understand that like the quadrant that is really problematic is multinational capitalism and why that is, and people get it really intuitively. And then like talking about like, well, what is worker ownership and why is it inherently more local and that kind of stuff. And that kind of thing, like if you can get a shtick to like help people understand things in really simple, grounded terms. Like nobody loves Monsanto. Nobody loves Big Bang.
Yeah.
And like really being able to articulate here's where the problem is, was, I think, super helpful. And so I'd say between the DSA website and doing simple stuff like that, that really helped a lot of people get it.
Okay, so let's go to our next question here. This comes from 22 Many. I'm struggling to see the Democratic Party as a mechanism to advance socialism. They seem to exist to filter out people like yourself. If you ever picked up steam and they come at you, why would you want to stay as a Democrat, or why did you run as a Democrat this cycle?
Yeah, well, and so again, I made that decision 14 months ago. And honestly, if I was making the decision today, I would have some different things to weigh. I think that the world has shifted in those last 14 months. And so I'm not actually sure if I decide to run again, if I would run as a Dem or not. But I was really clear that like, so there's this thin slice in the Democratic Party, and it's Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders and AOC, who I think have opened up some space within the Democratic Party for somebody like me to potentially be viable. And, there's things that you've got to weigh. I mean, how easy is it to get ballot access in your state? Like I had some colleagues, like in my case, it wouldn't have been that hard in terms of like, it's signatures. It's not a big money amount. I had some comrades who didn't get on the ballot because they couldn't raise $15,000 to pay the fee. And it's different if you're running as a Democrat. And so, there is a serious ballot access issue there that I think people have to weigh. And so I am not going to say that it's the right answer. And I totally get the skepticism. And I'm pretty sure that at least one of the candidates who was also in the race was recruited specifically to run against me because the Dems, a slice of our Wyoming Democratic Party did not want to get the nomination. And so I absolutely think you're right. I mean, I think that there is a certain filtering out process that's happening. And I may or may not have fallen victim to that myself in this race. I don't know what the real truth is behind the scenes, but I buy the rumor could be legit.
So let's extrapolate on that just a little bit. Like, obviously, we're in the middle. Like, the convention is going on right now as we're speaking to each other. How have you been feeling about the now Joe Biden being nominated? Have you had any thoughts about the fall regarding supporting that versus alternative parties? What have you been feeling about the national scene right now?
I mean, I feel like garbage about most of the national scene. I totally get that. And I don't know yet, and this is honest, I don't know yet whose bubble I'm going to fill in or if I'm going to write somebody in. Kamala Harris, that choice like simultaneously made me really angry. And also there's a few ways where it might make it more likely for me to fill in the bubble. It's just really complicated to sort out. And I live in the reddest state in the country. And so it probably doesn't matter what I do on my ballot.
How crazy is that? Like, you're in a very red state right now. I'm in a very blue state right now. We're both like trapped in my vote doesn't matter, but it's like we still expect us to show up because there is still that down ballot stuff. But
Well, I encourage people to like take that into account. I think that should be a factor in your decision making. I mean, if you're in a swing
Should
state,
be. The
I think
system shouldn't be in the long term. Like, we don't want
oh
people to
no,
think this way.
no,
Like,
no, you're right. You're
at a
right.
minimum, we need it to be proportional, like the electoral college, and then a maximum, you go full on get rid of the electoral college. But
Yeah.
that's an amendment.
Yeah.
But like,
I mean,
it's
I
just
would
sad.
I would get rid of the electoral college. What I'd love to see is get rid of the electoral college, move to ranked choice voting, and
Okay.
do proportional representation where, like, if
Sure.
the Green Party gets 5% of the vote, they should have 5% of Congress. I mean, I would love to see us make some serious shifts. And there's also, I could go on lengthily for the things that I've learned about how campaign finance laws are structured to make it damn near impossible for somebody like
We would
me.
love to get into that at another time, but as you said,
Yes,
we could go for an hour on that, and we don't have the time.
alone. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I said it before. Of like, my longest episode was that candidate supporter debate that we were talking about. The longest one, we were talking democracy for 16 hours. No, 10 hours. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, crazy. Love the subject. So yeah, I want to say I'm probably going to vote for Joe Biden. I think, frankly, Trump is very dangerous.
Yes.
I have no qualms against anyone who chooses third party. I voted Green Party in 2016. I understand, especially for the people in our situations where it's like your vote just doesn't feel like it matters. Like, so
Right.
I think it's going to be a tough one. Do you got time for one more bonus question? We got one more here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go with this one. So the Falcone General asks, do you have any thoughts about Liz Chaney in the upcoming primary in 2022? And, you know, this is kind of a bonus question, but like, had you heard about what had been going on with Alex Morris?
Yeah.
We could dive into that. Did you have any thoughts about that whole situation?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so Liz Chaney, you know, she's in the U.S. House of Representatives, and I just ran for the Senate seat. Her challenger, the Democratic nominee, is actually really interesting, and a woman named Lynette Grable, who is the first Indigenous woman to be major party nomination in Wyoming for a federal office. And so I will probably continue to back Lynette if she doesn't. I mean, you know, again, it's a long shot this time for her as well, but I would back Lynette running again. And actually, I asked around about whether there were any people of color thinking about running before I declared, because I really think that representation matters. So probably I won't run against Liz Chaney in 2022. I don't know if I'm ever going to run for anything again. I'm very much in the like decompression mode right now.
Yeah, it's a little early, honestly, to make that call, but
Totally. Yeah, and I feel like I've already addressed the democratizing the workplace question. So my thoughts on Alec Morris, you know, it's such a tough thing because there seems to be growing evidence that this was kind of a setup in his particular situation. And, you know, I am 100% in the, your first instinct is to believe people who make abuse accusations and then check it out. But like, I look at a thing like, you know, Shahid Buttar, who got, you know, some serious accusations thrown at him, and I don't believe her. Like when I've heard more and more stories from people about her, and so it's a really tough thing. I think like that first instinct to like believe people with abuse accusations, I think doesn't mean that you then ignore subsequent information that comes out. And it's interesting to me that it's, you know, gay men and men of color who get targeted with this kind of stuff really consistently, who are pretty progressive. And so I think we need to, you know, take some amount of like belief and then assessment and then skepticism if it seems to be called for. And so I'm at a skepticism place at this point about both of those sets of accusations. So
yeah, I think that's very fair. And, you know, one of the things that I think is pretty differentiating, especially for Alex Morse's case, is I think people kind of see any accusation of like, oh, story comes out that involves sexuality in any regard. It's like, oh, let's get on board. But like the actual accusation that the college Democrat made was simply that he used dating apps and messaged people who happened to be at that college.
Right.
It was nothing that he made unwarranted advancements. It was nothing that was actually heinous. He was a young mayor at the age of 21. He's a single man. Yeah, he's going to go on dating apps. And so it's like, I feel like we need to like be a little bit more sensitive and go deeper than just the headlines. Because sometimes people get caught like all things that are sexuality. Okay, we got to take caution here. But like from the very get-go, this wasn't even a particularly serious allegation.
Well, and I think the more serious part is that there is a power dynamic differential there. Like if you're the mayor, and I think he was actually a professor at the college for a
He was
while.
a professor, but it wasn't with like any of his students. It was just people he met on dating apps.
Right. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, this stuff is really complex. I mean, there's gender issues, there's heterosexism, there's racism, there's power dynamics, and I think you need to look at the, you know, as much as possible, all of that and how that seems to be interacting. And then also look at like who gets something out of this accusation, you know, bringing this person down. And, you know, and it seems like in both of these cases, that is one of the many factors that's going on in it, is that like, you know, like the previous question, I mean, I
do get a little nervous about that though, because then like the same thing, that's what Biden people say about progressives, that we just want to take him down, and they'll say that's what we're doing with Tara Reade. Like, I just feel like we have to treat them all as individual circumstances, not treat it partisanly, actually be willing to listen to everyone. Like, that's the thing. I don't necessarily say just believe them, but I think everyone should be heard. Like, we should hear what you have to say, and then let's vet the claim. Let's see how, if there's anyone that can confirm it. So I certainly hope that people also give a little grace. Like, there are some things that, especially if it's long ago, it's like you learn to be a better person over time. But it's certainly a issue.
You know, the Tara Reade stuff is more believable to me because we all watch Biden doing funky stuff on film over and over and over again. It's like, this man does not have appropriate boundaries. Sure. And so that adds to me. And so I do believe her. And I do think that Joe Biden has some things to answer for. And it's hard, you know, being asked to vote between two men who both have really messed up boundaries with women. And it's like, ugh.
I mean, I certainly agree with you that Joe Biden is handsy. Yeah, I haven't gotten to that point. We did a whole video at one point of why I had some skepticisms. I like would 100% believe grazed a leg, 100% believe when he sakes some comments. I just don't think it's in his character to penetrate someone. That's the only difference. I think he needs to completely own that he's too handsy and rectify his ways. But I'm thankful for the question, Falcone General. Thank you for having this conversation with me today, Yana. I really appreciate getting your perspective. Is there anything you're hoping people can go check out if they enjoyed hearing yourself? How they can keep in touch with you, or other things that they should be go check out?
Yeah, I mean, all of our campaign social media is still up. So, you know, and I imagine like both my Twitter and Facebook accounts are going to get turned into something, maybe some future political things. So check those out. Also encourage people to support Lynette Graybles. You know, she's taking on the Chaney clan. That's a huge thing. And she's an Indigenous woman. And so she is like, it's David and Goliath in like larger than life terms. And so I would love to see people be supporting her bid. I also, and I
don't know where they could check that out, by the way.
Yeah. Yes. If you just Google Lynette Graybull, and it's 2 words, Graybull. I think it's .com, but I'm not actually sure. I should know this.
We'll have some sleuths out there. Guys, I'm sure you all know how to use Google.
Yes,
try and find Lynette Graybull.
The other thing I want to say, which is a little bit off the beaten path from the conversation we've been having, is that I have a book coming out in mid-September called The Cooperative Culture Handbook. And this goes back to my working with social justice organizations and intentional communities and nonprofits who want to be doing things more cooperatively. So look for that in mid-September if you're intrigued with the idea that we have some serious culture change work to do that affects and sort of runs underneath a lot of this political stuff. So.
Okay. Well, Yana, when the book comes, you'll have to let us know again so we can go check it out and have you back on again. It was a pleasure getting to talk with you today and learn about your campaign that you just wrapped up.
Thanks so much for having me. It's fun to do a little retrospective.
Oh, I certainly agree. Well, I hope you have a great rest of your night, and I hope you will keep in touch.
Thanks.
Hey. Everyone, that was Yana Ludwig. We enjoyed having this conversation today because I think it's really important to figure out how we eventually progress these particularly red areas to our progressive causes over time. And then we take moments after our campaigns to learn the lessons that we need to from them. You know, every time we stumble, we should use that as an opportunity to learn. With that being said, let's talk our upcoming schedule. And, if you like what you saw today, please make sure you like today's video. Go give it a share so that you can have this conversation be heard by others. And make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified whenever we go live every Monday to Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. With that being said, let's talk our upcoming schedule this week. So we only got one more episode this week because I'll be off this Friday. Tomorrow, we'll be talking to Meg Gorman. She's from Tennessee's 3rd Congressional District. Then we'll be having another full week of candidates as well as karma credits on next week. And hopefully, if we can secure a Trump supporter, we're going to have another candidate supporter debate on Friday the 28th. So we're looking for people who will represent Trump, who will represent Joe Biden, who will represent Howie Hawkins, and who will represent Joe Jorgensen. So we got a packed schedule coming up ahead. So thank you all for tuning in today. Make sure you go share this video if you're still tuning in to the live part. I love when you're all here still listening to the rambles and the plugs. But guys, I hope you guys are staying safe out there. I love you all for tuning in. And as always, I hope you guys stay rosy.